Okay, so good morning. We're about 3 minutes after the hour, and I'm going to get started. Welcome to our monthly ECSS Symposium. So we have two speakers today. We have Davide Del Vento, who's going to be speaking first about the GSMBox, the Science Gateway for Geospatial Computing. And our second speaker is going to be John Urbanik from PSC, who's going to talk about the Exceed Monthly Workshop. So we're just going to jump right in. For those of you who are ECSS staff, I would like to also encourage you to consider signing up to present at the ECSS Symposium. So we have plenty of openings for 2019. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Davide. So take it away.
Hello, everybody. As I'm Davide Del Vento. I work at Anchor, and I also work for Exceed as an ECSS consultant. So in this presentation, I will talk about a GSMBox, which is an Exceed ECSS. Particularly, it's an NIP, so novel and innovative project that is targeted at scientists, scholars, educators from disciplines that have not yet made significant use of advanced computing resources. So this project actually has just concluded, but as a sort of a phoenix, it has restarted, and I'll mention briefly about that at the end. So can go to the next slide, please. So this all started with Dr. Curtis Marion, who is an archaeologist and a paleoanthropologist. Is focusing on the origin of modern humans with questions like, what were the foraging strategies and how they shaped the evolution of modern human behavior. So he's the PI of a fairly large NSF and Hyde Family Foundation grant. This grant is to study the human origins and how do they relate to climate and environment. So, here the word climate is actually the reason why I got first involved at this, since I work at Anchor, which has a big section, it's big on climate and weather research. And so that's why I get involved in this at the beginning. So, but back to this PI, he's more of kind of a field researcher, from disciplines not commonly associated with high performance computing, even though for this particular grant, the word climate made the bridge. So if we go to the next slide, he is leading a large international project to study the humans of 140,000 years ago in South Africa. And the behavior of humans were related to climate, as I just, that's the purpose of the study. And the climate also, and not only to the climate, but also to the sea level, which was very different from the current one. Because sea level impacted the coastline and the way that various food could be found. And obviously that the flora and fauna that could be a source of food mostly. So, and all these things were in turn related to other climate characteristics such as the temperature and precipitation. So in the past, some of these things were either seen from archaeological evidence, you see the coastline, some from, study on the field and say, okay, well, at this time, the coastline was such and such, or you find some fossils from particular biology beings and say, well, these were there. And you kind of guess what the temperature might have been, if you find a particular plant that, ranged survival in a certain temperature range, you say, well, that must be temperature. So they were either discovered that way, or if they couldn't get that evidence, they would just do some positing and say, okay, well, let's assume that the temperature was in this range. But right now, instead, if you go to the next slide, what the Dr. Marion team is using, a couple models to actually model all these, as far as possible. So he's using climate model. It's running climate models to simulate the climate characteristic of the region. The vegetation models that are based on the output of the climate model to produce some simulation of what the possible vegetation could have been. And then there were some agent-based model to simulate the foraging strategy and the mobility of the human or human beings. And these use the output from both the vegetation model and the climate model, and those are massaged before being used in this agent-based model, because they want to know the abundance of various food and things like that. So all of this is basically changing the way that paleoanthropology and archaeology are studied. So as I said before, the scientists in these disciplines will just find bones or other evidence and made hypotheses and argued about which one may have occurred. Now they have a way to validate different hypotheses, at least partially, in an objective way. So it's a big thing for ECSS to be able to serve also people that work in disciplines such as these that have not traditionally made significant use of advanced computing infrastructure yet. And so that's lead us to the next slide, where once a person like an anthropologist who want to start running a climate model, it gets into what is a challenge. So I mean, it's not a particular challenge for all of us, I'm sure, getting a command line interface, but for researchers, and particularly in the people that work in the geoscience and social, behavioral, health, environment, economic sciences, maybe economic a little less, but still, I could find it a little challenging to familiarize and correctly using all the nitty-gritty details of the high performance computing, and they get lost into the weeds before they can even start the science. In fact, if we go to the next slide, if they even try, they are hit by a high learning curve, and not the previous one, and they spend so much more in the computing details than they initially expected, sometimes causing not enough time spent on the science. So one way to solve this problem is to use the science gateways, which probably most of you are familiar with, but in case you haven't yet heard the term, and I won't say you're living under a rock, but I'm having this slide anyway. So these are web-based tools that allow scientists and engineers to access computing resources and computer-related services that are particularly tailored to their disciplines, and therefore very close to their needs, without some other things that they might not need, and they might confuse them. And so therefore they are much easier to use than the bare HPC resources. So moreover, if you go to the next slide, as science gateways foster collaborative science, because various researchers in the same discipline will use the same web platform, so they they could gather together into that environment, even though they might not be using the same HPC resources under the hood. They might still using the same web interface to them. And another advantage that most of these science gateways do not require the need to write an allocation proposal, even though that is a kind of fairly low bar for ECSS, but that still might be a bar for somebody that has never done so before, from one of these fields. So after this introduction, if you go to the next slide, let me start talking about GSMBox itself. So this project has begun exactly to help that project that I described briefly. That project has started with a different name. So instead of calling GIS Sandbox at the time, it was named the Paleoscape project. And we have identified 3 key aspects as a must-have for the success of that. So the first one is interactivity, and that goes into 2 fronts. The first front is a kind of a user-friendly graphical user interface. That's not a command line interface, even though within the GUI itself there might be the need to type some commands. Those will be limited to not open-ended, like could be, you know, a Unix shell where you can invoke other things and be open-ended to anything, you know, more a limited input to a, you know, Python or something more simple to use. So that's the first aspect of interactivity. And then there is the second aspect, which I was kind of mentioning before, that, you know, they may have access to different things. So they might have access to a machine that's better tailored to do, you know, the climate model, whereas, you know, the agent model might be more suited to a different machine. And researchers on these disciplines do not have the time to, and frankly, it's not their job to study, okay, well, to do the task X, I need to use machine A, and to do the task Y, I need to use machine B. So here, a unified interface will help, you know, lower the bar in that direction. The second point is the scalability. So, you know, everybody today, I guess, even field scientists like an archaeologist will use a laptop, I assume, in most cases. So we want to give them something that's, you know, not just a simple server or a virtual machine that might not be even larger than a laptop, but something that's able to deal with things that certainly won't fit the laptop. And we could have done that with a, you know, very large and beefy server. But we want to do even more than that. So some, you know, ability to work with data sets that doesn't fit any memory, disk space, or computer power that even a beefy server could provide. So that's one aspect of scalability. The other aspect is, you know, the kind of embarrassing parallel tasks, such as repeated simulations with different parameters and things like that. And for word-to-word reproducibility, that's kind of a unfortunate things of the what I call the third leg of the, you know, of science. After theory and experiment, there is the computing. But, you know, unlike theory and experiment, oftentimes computing is not fully reproducible. Because, you know, maybe some software, some part of the software stack has been upgraded for security or other reasons, and the dependency is not be able to run the code anymore, or maybe even worse, that's very common here at NCAR, and for climate model in general. The code still runs, but spits out different results. And in case you're not familiar with this problem, that's very common in the climate and the weather, because of the, you know, sensible dependence from initial condition of these kind of models, that basically you have an exponential, you know, the error that propagates through the PD solvers is unbound because of that, you know, dependency of the initial condition. So to address this, if you go to this slide, good. That's a screenshot of the GSMBox gateway prototype. I mean, we call it prototype, but we are kind of using it in semi-production already. And so this is a web portal where, you know, researchers can do GIS-related work that would not fit their workstations. And they can use Jupyter notebooks. We have seen that most of these people are already familiar with, and a few that are not will become very familiar with quickly. So this covers at least part of the aspects of the GUI interactivity. And let me skip for a second on the unified access while we go to the next slide, where I just go back to this list for scalability. So, so for scalability, we need these two things. And the way to achieve that is described in the next slide, where we basically allow users to have a batch execution of, can you go to the next slide? A batch execution on HPC resources. So we could have just used, as I briefly mentioned before, a single beefy server for computing and data storage. But that would limit the scale. There will be still a limit to the scale that, whatever we can offer, how many cores, how many memory, what's quota. So that's would have been one approach. Another approach that other people have taken would be to use several servers that, could be spun out of on demand, but that would add lots of complexities, especially to move the data around, because you have, sorry about that, because you would have each server that's spun out, it wouldn't have necessarily access to the file system of the original server. So you either have to add a parallel file system to the system itself, and so kind of add another pretty complicated part, or you have to move the data around each time you span a new server. So instead of doing that, GSMBox uses the Exceed supercomputers, such as Comet and Bridges, and their parallel file system, which is already well set up and ready to use for us, and we just make them easily used for scientists. So that's a relatively easy thing to do, and in a win-win situation. So if you go to the next slide, I have a little bit of detail on how we have done that. Not much detail, but enough for this talk, and I'm happy to take any questions about that. So we developed this Python package called NB-Submit that interfaces our science gateway with remote HPC platforms. And this does it almost seamlessly, because the way that it does, it makes you take whatever you're running locally and you just say, well, but run this somewhere else. So this covers both the scalability, because once you say, well, run this cluster, you could scale to larger jobs. I mean, very easily for the parameter sweep that I described before. A little more complicated if you are trying, again, hitting the single node limit for your data set, but there are still options there. And also solves the problem of unified access of interactivity, because here, okay, well, you have to have a little bit of user education still, that you have to say, well, Comet versus Bridges versus something else, but you don't need to learn, maybe one thing is using Slurm and another one is using PBS. You do not need to know about that. This will look all the same to you, because we have done the work for the scientists. Now, at the moment, the GUI is not available, but we are working on that, and so we will have a Jupyter Lab plugin that will allow to do all this with buttons instead of these 3 lines of code are still considered barriers by some. So we'll try to limit that. And if you go to the next slide, so that's about reproducibility, something that I mentioned before, and I don't need to repeat what I said. If you could, the next slide again. So there are different aspects of that reproducibility. So the first one is about a notebook format itself, which facilitates reproducibility, because whatever you try there as an exploration, it could make it easy that what's computed there, and maybe you add there a comment that says, oh, this is the plot generated by that, and it could be the plot that you then put in a journal publication, and that plot is not taken out of the blue, but it comes straight out of the run. So that's one aspect of it that's kind of still the researcher responsibility to make sure what's doing is reproducible in that regard, but the format facilitates that much more than before. But the aspects that instead are from the platform itself is the container technology that we are using. And so we are using Singularity, which is less popular Docker, but it's a better fit for HPC infrastructure. And what we're doing is that, basically everything that runs either into the GIS sandbox itself or the HPC resources will use Singularity with the same configuration, and so run. If whatever you run just on the machine itself, you just say, well, but run the same thing on Comet. Maybe you get an error, out of memory or whatever, and you say, well, okay, run it there on this other machine. It will submit it to the queue, and just run it there, and it will hopefully just works. So in addition to all of this, there is also the infrastructure point of view of reproducibility, because we have a plethora of test development, semi-production, production instances, and then maybe we need to redeploy in various cases, if there is crashes or other issues that might happen in production instances, and maybe we could, by mistake or by accident or just because something else has been upgraded, deploy something different. So what we're using is Ansible as a way to simplify and make it reproducible from the installation point of view. So if you go to the next slide, that's kind of a bird's view of the architecture that I guess right now you have understood it. The architecture consists in two main parts. So the first one is Jupyter, that itself is two parts. It's the hub and the notebooks that are running on Jetstream and are directly accessed by the user. And the second part are the remote jobs submitted to the supercomputer. The data is also on the supercomputer, high parallel performance file system mounted via SSH-FS. So if you go to the next slide, so this diagram shows some of the many moving parts, and because of time, I will not go into the main details here, but I'm going to describe only the main ones in the next couple of slides. And we have a paper at PERC 2018 with more details. I'll be obviously happy to take any questions also. But if you want more and you don't have time for questions, or you just want to know more details without an explicit question, you can get that paper. So if you go to the next slide, I'm basically describing what was in the previous graph. So the first thing is the Jupyter Hub that's running on a web-exposed Jetstream instance with a dynamic DNS pointing to it. So the hub is needed for multi-user access. The authentication is delegated to Exceed via CI logon. So once the user is authenticated, Jupyter notebooks are spawned on a Jetstream instance. At the moment, we're using the same instance where Jupyter Hub is running. Potentially, that could be easily made as a new one, might be instantiated on the fly. So far, we haven't seen the need for doing that, but we are keeping an eye, the load and things like that. And then once that Jupyter notebook is running, things could happen there, or things could happen on the remote file system and remote machines. As I said, with a almost seamless integration with NV Submit. So if we go to the next slide, we'll see what the user sees. Basically, this is the same thing that I just described, but from the way that the user sees. So they go to the website and they click login, and they go basically to Exceed website that asks their Exceed username and password, and do if they have that configured. And once they get there, they see a familiar Jupyter Notebook interface popping up, and many of them were actually running Jupyter Notebooks on their laptop already. And so they could still do some small work and jobs on Jetstream itself that might still be larger than their laptop, depending which laptop they have. Or just running exactly the same job on the supercomputer with that 3 lines of code that I showed before. In addition, they have many Python and R library and GIS things that probably they have on their laptops, but not necessarily. GDAL might be complicated for them to install on their laptop and things like that, and they might not have particular things. Like NetLogo or ArcGIS, unless they really needed that. That's, I mean, it's not rocket science, but it's not straightforward. Somebody that's not a computing guy to install. So if you go to the next slide, I will just briefly mention some challenges of this project. The first one is, the performance that we have local and remote data mounted via SSHFS. So from our testing, we show that all the metadata operation and low volume data operations are basically indistinguishable because they are accessing the web anyway. So it's not at the limiting factor from SSH mounting from Jetstream to one of the HPC resources, pretty fast network. However, if they do try large computing, if they try to do that on Jetstream, they will have troubles. If they try to do that remotely, they may have asking many nodes, and there will be waiting queue. So user education will still be needed. So this is not panacea. So that's the first challenge. The second challenge is more about for us. It's lots of software to install and manage. Ansible is a great tool to do that, and it kind of mitigates that issue, but the issue is still there. And the third one is about a number and kind of servers that we deploy and need to maintain and keep updated and things like document what we have done for ourselves and for possible new members of our team. And Ansible helps with that too, but also if you have many servers, I think I couldn't find any tool that totally solves that problem. If you have any suggestion, I will be happy to hear about it. And finally, that project just expired, but it has been renewed for another year. But if it didn't, and not renewed, actually, it has been submitted as a different project, but it doesn't matter much. But when the second one will expire, I doubt that will be a third year. And if that didn't happen this year, I'm not sure how that everything that that made this project possible, especially maintenance, continues once the grant is done. So we are exploring different options there. We didn't find something that's total solution. And if you go to the next slide, that's my last one with some future work. So we had a security audit with some recommendation, and we have implemented only the main ones so far. We want to implement them all. We want to complete the containerization of remote jobs, which it's proceeding, but there are still some kinks to iron out. Then for the ArcGIS, there are some legal and technical details that also need to be fully figured out. And so these are, in progress. And then partners are actually using and testing the system right now. And actually the day after tomorrow, there will be somebody using that in production in a class, as for curriculum and for teaching, and if it works fine, they will have an exam using this platform. And finally, we want to generally improve usability and utility of the system to allow to do it, transition from that. I won't call it prototype anymore, but I will call it just production. And as I said, that's the goal for a new NIP project, and I guess that's the reason why it's a new project and not a continuation, because the previous one was to make this as a prototype, a little more than a proof of concept, but still not ready for production. And I think we are close there, but there is work to be done that's doable, but it requires a little more effort that we'll do is for the second year. And the real final slide is just acknowledgements. So Exceed itself for the allocation, and CI Logon, actually, it's a great service and fantastic support. If you ever need, to some unified access, I couldn't speak as good as they are about them. So just go there and use them because they are fantastic. Then, of course, the Science Gateway Community Institute in general for various things, and especially Mark Krentz for a cybersecurity audit, and Sergio and Nancy for initial guidance on this project. And I'm sure I'm forgetting someone else, but that's what fit in the slide. So I'm ready for questions now.
Great, thank you, Davide. That was a fascinating presentation. Do we have any questions?
I do have one question for Davide. Thank you for that very interesting talk. On one of your slides, you mentioned remote mounting of supercomputer file systems. I was wondering if you can talk a little bit more about how that works.
So yes, the notebook instance running on Jetstream will have the local file system mounted on Jetstream instance itself, and that will be available as a local file system to save and data and notebooks and code. But there will also be available to user to use under a different mount point the file system of Comet and Bridges that will be mounted using SSH-FS. So from the perspective of the communication, that will be just an SSH command that's happening under the hood and nobody sees. And that SSH commands will do things like ls and things like that, and cat and things that just POSIX commands on Bridges or Comet. So that's what Bridges and Comet will see. And this data is migrated by the SSH-FS driver into something that will look like on the local machine like it's a local file system, just as happening remotely.
Oh, that's very interesting. Does it allow write as well as read?
It does, yes, if you have permission, of course. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Mona. Do we have any more questions for Davide? No, let me ask one quick question. Actually, I have a bunch and I could follow up later, but one question though about the use of containers, fantastic. It does give you a lot of portability, but are you seeing any performance impact from using containers? So for example, you have a container that you want to be able to run on Jetstream, Comet, Bridges. They may have different architectures. So do you see any negative performance impacts?
Actually, no. I mean, if we measure it, we haven't measured for this particular project, but we have measured in a different context, while using containers in HPC for other reasons. And I guess you can measure it. It's a kind of single-digit % performance penalty. But here we are talking about, going to the web and then going to SSH to the other machine in 2 hops. So you see variability that's not due to the container that's, probably an order of magnitude larger than what a container is impacting. So I guess if you do good enough statistics, you could see that, 3% penalty, but otherwise, if you are seeing a 10% difference from one run to another because of the web, then it doesn't really matter.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question.
Bob, can I ask it?
Go ahead, Phil.
Davide, and forgive me if you already addressed this in your talk and I missed it. If there were another group that wanted to do something similar to what you've done, how easy would it be for them to reuse the framework that you've created? First, I guess, would it be okay for them to reuse this framework? And second, do you think that would be, how hard do you think it would be for someone to adapt this to another project's need that had similar needs to yours?
So the NB Submit is open source. It will be easy to use by a different team that wants to do something similar. And that will be totally fine. I guess we would like to know about it so that we can collaborate if needed. But it's there, they can just use it. The rest of the thing is not open source yet. That's part of the cybersecurity audit. we don't think we have anything confidential or really secret, and we are not doing security by obscurity, but we are taking, the better safe than sorry approach before open sourcing it. But we do plan to open source it, and we are certainly open to other groups, reaching out to us that they want it now. We can allow access just to them for this purpose now, and eventually we'll plan to open it to everybody anyway. So I didn't answer that in the talk. And did I fully answer what you asked, or there was something else, I think?
Yeah, no, I think no, that's helpful. I think it could be potentially useful to others who have similar needs, even who've come to ECSS looking for similar solutions.
Certainly has a more general audience than the rest, because the rest, it's kind of server configuration that, installing ArcGIS. I guess if you're using ArcGIS, installing and configuring that will be useful, but otherwise it's kind of if you're doing, I don't know, an economics science gateway, then you don't need ArcGIS. You might need NetLogo, so they may use that part. So it's a little more specific depending on the field, and that's the part that's not open yet. But NB submitted a remote job in a more convenient way. That will definitely be more useful to more people, and it's already open right now.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, Davide. So I know we went a little bit over, but I talked to our other speaker and he said that he didn't need the full half an hour. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I will turn things over to John Urbanek.
Okay, thank you. That is indeed the case. I do not need as much time, so we're not on a trajectory, fear not, to go to 2:30. I should be able to wrap up on time. So I will let Bob confirm that I am now sharing my presentation. Is that the case?
Yep, yes, you are.
Okay. Well, then I'll jump right into it. I want to give everybody kind of an overview and the general philosophy of our monthly workshops, in particular as they pertain to ECSS. I do a lot of ECSS myself. Got a couple projects at the moment. I've done many in the past. One of the things that I often run into is that as you near the conclusion of a collaboration, the technical advances that you've helped to enable in the code and the project in general really do need to be transferred or handed off to somebody for future maintenance as you phase yourself out. And myself, many times, that amounts to trying to level up the end user so that they can maintain what I've done for them. For example, if you've accelerated somebody's code with a GPU and they're not a GPU programmer, how do you help them to become, a GPU programmer? Maybe not with the level of expertise that you had as you implemented their algorithm and optimized it silly, but at least to the point where they can understand it and maintain it. And well, one of the answers to that is, I think a big part of the answer to that is the workshops that we do, because we do allow you to point somebody. I do it myself, say, hey, if you go to the next MPI workshop, then in a reasonable amount of time that you can carve out of your calendar, you can get up to speed to the point where at least we can communicate and we can do this technology transfer, this knowledge transfer. So we send a lot of users from the workshops to ECSS as well. So I think it works both ways. We also send a lot of users all over Exceed. We're now across the 11,000 student count. And those are real students in seats, right? Those aren't just somebody with a webinar running in the background while they did something else. So we've sent a lot of people all over Exceed from our workshops. As a matter of fact, the majority of people that come to our workshops do not know what Exceed is. Exceed is just a mysterious acronym that was in the invitation mail that they got to come to some workshop that the subject matter interested them. But a lot of people sitting there as I introduce the workshop have no idea what Exceed is. So for a lot of people, we're their entry point into Exceed. The workshops themselves, for those of you, and I'll assume that many of you are not at all familiar with our workshops, are not the typical MOOC or webinar kind of format. A big part of the structure, our secret recipe that allows us to be effective and deliver the degree of satisfaction that we do, is the fact that we have a very high quality, high reliability infrastructure behind everything. It doesn't happen by accident, but it's because we're not relying upon just WebEx or Zoom or whatever. We have an infrastructure that's got a central video hub and a producer monitoring that in real time. It allows us to have multiple channels to each one of our satellite sites so that we have both a content channel as well as a speaker channel. They're both high quality HD. Each site has a TA. The TA at that site might not be and often isn't a domain expert. They don't really understand the content of the class in depth. They don't need to. But what they do enable is the ability for us to get all the logistical rough edges, which can just bog a workshop down, to keep that from interfering and bubbling up. For example, just network access, account issues. The TAs can certainly deal with those at the least. Some of them do have domain expertise and can help with exercises and whatnot, but it's really important when you have hundreds of students to have TAs there that can make sure that those simple-minded accounting issues don't, again, percolate up to the point where it's a distraction to the entire workshop. And behind the scenes, we always have an HPC resource for these workshops. It's varied over the years. At the moment, it's mostly focused on bridges because that's convenient and near to those of us that run it, but it can be any resource. And the fact that it is an HPC resource is key. The students leave these workshops having used an HPC resource, not some cloud thing, and then you tell them that their skills will translate and they hope it might and believe you kind of. No, they get done with this and they've used an Exceed environment. They've had Exceed accounts. That enables a lot more stickiness for them to believe that they can stick around and use the resource. But mostly it really enhances the credibility because they understand that they have actually used an HPC platform as it was intended. The general philosophy for these workshops is that because we have this remote infrastructure, we don't have to justify flying people in and padding out the schedule. So we don't have to pad the workshops out. We make them exactly as long as they should be. We also recognize that our attendees have real lives. They're carving out valuable time out of their daily routines to come, and so we compact everything down as best we can. We deal with different time zones as best we can. So we try to respect that, and I think that comes across well from the surveys that we get back. But we mostly keep in mind that learning is a social process. It is very much driven by the interaction, not just with some remote speaker and some content, but with their fellow students. They can turn to their student next to them and say, hey, is that right? Is that a typo up there? Because this isn't working for me. And that fellow student can say, oh, it works for me, or yeah, you're right, this doesn't work for me either. Or yeah, that speaker, I think he left something out, or is he going too fast, or is, did she not mention some URL that's in the slide? So you can get that social process with the format that we use here, which is just a key ingredient. And it turns out, again, in our satisfaction surveys, which I'll mention, it comes across that this is really important. MOOCs, these massive online courses, for example, that don't even make an attempt to reproduce that and assume that you're some isolated standalone student out there, on your own. They don't capture that. They don't enable that. And as a consequence, they typically have very, very low satisfaction rates and follow-through rates because it's missing that part. So the wide area classroom, which is what we call this infrastructure, this formula, has enabled us to preserve that in-class experience while we still logistically can accommodate remote sites and hit 25 different sites scattered across the country and have hundreds of students, but with that in-class experience. Our monthly workshop schedule covers what we consider to be the bread and butter topics of HPC. So we focus on this. Exceed has a lot of offerings in education out there. I invite all of you to explore the calendar and be aware of them. We try to stick with the ones that are very fundamental, meat and potatoes kind of topics that apply to HPC in particular. So we're not trying to address every trendy thing that comes across the world of computer science or computing. And the ones that typically can assure you that your investment now will be relevant over the next decade. I mean, I can say with credibility that the topics you're looking at right now, 10 years from now, they will still be relevant. So you're not learning kind of the fad of the day. So that's our approach. The calendar next year will look very similar to this year's. Our survey process, we can't address everybody's needs and desires and, for which direction we go in the future, but we try to hit the middle of the bell curve. And at the moment, it looks like we're there. So next year's going to look similar to this one. You'll notice in the middle of the calendar there's a summer boot camp. That's the one chance when we get to mix and match all these topics together and teach hybrid computing. That is always fun and exciting for me, but I think for a lot of the students. And it's really kind of the learn everything there's to know about HPC in 1 week kind of event. And we'll also have that again next year. At the moment, we're coming up on our MPI workshop in a couple of next week. The new calendar for next year will be posted very shortly, hopefully in the next month or so. The agendas for these workshops, so here are, for the short events, these are the agendas right here, just to give you a quick idea of how packed they are, but at the same time, they preserve a lot of hands-on. We're very, very much enthused by the notion that the hands-on is what guarantees you that stickiness, that the knowledge has really actually been acquired by the students. It lowers the barrier the intimidation barrier of the HPC resource. If they've used it during the workshop and they've done exercises successfully and applied the technology you're teaching them, the odds that they will go then and immediately apply that to their project are much better than if they've just heard a lot of buzzwords for a couple of days and they're not at all sure that they've absorbed enough to apply it practically. So our agendas are really tight. You'll see we've crammed a whole lot into any given day, but there's always time, substantial time, for hands-on exercises. Over the past couple of years, we've also taken the approach that we provide a lot of bonus exercises, if you will, and allow the students to keep their accounts for a couple of weeks afterwards. That's been useful and helpful, I think, in in extending that kind of, hey, you're on the machine, stay there kind of attitude. But we very much want to make sure that if they have to wrap up at 5 o'clock that last day, that they have at that point in time applied everything we've taught them. We've reached a pretty broad community out there. We've got a lot of demographics from diverse kinds. This map here is just showing general populations across the country, although we do have some of the minority serving institutions broken out separately here. The idea is that we've been able to reach broadly because of this infrastructure. The wide area classroom allows us to go into, say, a minority serving institution that might only have 6 or 7 students. So they couldn't possibly justify, say, a visit from somebody from NVIDIA or somebody that's got expertise, but we can bring them into our workshop and they still get that level of attention. They still have an instructor. They still have somebody they can raise a hand and ask a question of, even though their site typically wouldn't be able to justify, again, that site visit type of in-class experience. So we've reached a broad community. One thing I don't have in here is detailed demographic breakdowns, although I could go into them in great depth and spend a lot of time on it because we do capture all of that information. And we have a third-party group, actually, Lorna Rivera and Stefano, who do this for us in an objective way, and they do allow us to brag about our demographic outreach. We also have some international participants. In the past, we've had KAUST, which is the primary university in Saudi Arabia. We've now brought in CMU Portugal in our upcoming events. These issues, these remote sites always bring up time zone issues. They aggravate the time zone issues within the United States. I think we're pretty good at accommodating in a reasonable way because of the way we do slot our schedules around. International, it's a little bit harder to deal with, but it gives you some idea of enthusiasm for what we're doing. So as I mentioned, we do have a number of dimensions we measure demographically. I'll just throw up this one right here to give you some idea of the different universities. So we have, top tier schools in computer science. You'll see there virtually all of them. Anybody that's anybody in computer science, does participate in our program. But we also have small institutions, minority serving institutions, that again wouldn't be able to typically get that kind of presentations that we bring to them. So we're proud of the fact that we can reach all the way across, many, many different types of demographics. And we'll also pass 11,000 students with this upcoming workshop over the past 5 years. And those are, again, they're real students. They're not, we did a webinar and 11,000 people registered for it kind of students. The satisfaction surveys I mentioned we give at the end of every workshop. Evaluation and feedback is what's helped to shape these things into what they currently are. And it's because we pay a lot of attention to them. We have a lot of written comment fields, and we really go over them and look and let the feedback push us into our future directions and sand the rough edges off. So I'll just point out a few of that. I'm just throwing up some of the highlights here. And any of you that are interested in this, we'd be glad to provide more detailed data. But the things I think are most interesting are the questions that basically say, hey, would I recommend this workshop to somebody else, or would I rate this workshop as successful? And we're very happy with the fact that we're out of 5 stars, we're 4+ in all categories. And that's, again, it reflects the fact that we've responded to feedback over the years and we listen to people. And again, demographics, we reached generally much better than typical events in this space. We have much better demographics, et cetera, et cetera. To give credit to a lot of this, these are the people that are primarily involved with the workshops. Tom Maiden does a fantastic job of managing the very complex logistics of juggling 25 sites every month, 400 students. So he manages all of that, keeps it on track, keeps everybody relatively happy, even though the demand is much greater than we can respond to. We can't do more than 400 students a month, because once you get past 400 students, the questions just become overwhelming, and it quits becoming a classroom experience and starts turning into a MOOC where, you can't give students, the ability to raise their hands. That's a real world limit. If all the students were flown in to the presentation site, still 400 is as many students as you can put in a lecture hall and really have it be a lecture instead of just a broadcast. And so because the demand is greater than what we can, every month, Tom manages that and still keeps the rotation going and keeps people happy so that we can accommodate schools that, feel like they haven't been left, given an opportunity in a while, et cetera, et cetera. He does the registration, all the accounts for that stuff. Deals with the system administration issues on the HPC platform, where those are not trivial for the kind of things that we want to do. We're giving 400 students real-time access, interactive access typically to these platforms. Lots of other things, I'm sure I'm forgetting many of them, but Tom glues everything together. Steve Cunningham runs this AV infrastructure in the background, and so you don't see his face much because he's so successful that you don't know he's there, essentially. He does all of the AV setup with the sites. And again, these aren't WebEx, connections. These are multiple channel HD connections. And so he makes sure all of that stuff is in place and works in real time. You've got 25 sites. If something goes wrong with the site, you can't sit around and try to debug it in real time with them. And so we avoid those situations because Steve is so good at this stuff. And he does it both in advance and occasionally in real time when we do have a situation. He also does the video production because I'll mention a few more people later that we do try to record these things in a high quality fashion, which has now become part of our YouTube channel, and Steve manages all of that. I do the content creation and delivery for these thus far. We're always hoping to recruit more presenters and do more, but currently at the limiting of what our funding and our time will permit. I mentioned that we do hope to, we've long had hopes of doing persistent content. It's one of the most unmet demand that we've had over the years in our surveys, and feedback has been people that say, can you put this stuff in some persistent fashion? Even though we recognize that, YouTube videos are not reproducing the classroom experience. So, still there's value in that. People do want the recording so that they can refer to them. They can point people that just couldn't make the event at them, et cetera, et cetera. So again, even though we acknowledge it's not reproducing a class, we've wanted to do this for a long time. It takes a lot of effort to do it. Fortunately, Susan out there has put in an awful lot of effort to get these up and going. So we finally have our YouTube channel. It's Exceed Training. We've got events up there and we're incrementally adding to those. Susan's done a tremendous job of putting together all of these with and learning how to do it too, because this is unique. We're trying to get from one unique format into a video format. So I encourage any of you that are interested to subscribe to the channel, and you can see what's there and what's popping up as we go along. We also leave the content and exercises and whatnot online, but the video is the thing that really was missing for a while and people really wanted to see. We also have an effort to integrate this in with the general badging roadmap that we have in the EOT effort and Exceed, and we've started to have some badges now. These are important to a certain subsection of students, that they have some kind of credential or certificate as a result of this, and this has been an effort of Sandy and Jeff. Go ahead and you can explore what they've got up there with the badges. I expect that these will grow greater and greater in popularity and gain momentum as we go along. So much as I'm tempted to bore you with all of the details that make all these things successful behind the scenes, I will refrain, but I would be happy to take any questions and suggestions that you have, either now or via email. I'm always happy to hear from people about how we can improve what we're doing.
All right, thank you, John, for that great talk. We're very informative. Do we have any questions?
I do have one question. Sorry if you've already mentioned this and I missed it, but how does one get you guys to come in and do this kind of training? Is it free, or how does that work?
Yes, it is absolutely free. It is supported by Exceed. And if you contact Tom Maiden, whose email may or may not have been in there, but mine certainly is. You can contact me as an expedient. But Tom generally is the point of contact for these. And you can, and he is happy to then serve as the initialization for all the arrangements that need to be made to get into one of these events. So we would be delighted to hear from you. Very often these days, campus champions, for example, become aware of it and become the instigator on their campus for one of these events. And then once they happen, typically they become repeat events because people are generally happy with the results in their local community. But yes, please get in touch. With me if my contact information is right in front of you right now. But Tom Maiden certainly is happy to hear from anybody about these.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mona. Do we have any more questions for John?
Yeah, hi, this is Lars from TAC. Hey, John, that was an interesting talk. While you were speaking, I was trying to Google Exceed HPC monthly workshop, and I was directed to the normal course calendar where your great effort is just kind of muddled in between all the other events. Is there a dedicated website where you have the calendar just for your events?
That is an excellent point, Lars. At this point in time, there is not. I think we are trying our best to stay integrated with Exceed and keep the flow going, but I certainly share your opinion that we can kind of get lost in the noise there. Tomorrow's call with Susan, this is top of my agenda. Susan, forewarning. I agree with Lars, and maybe we can discuss this tomorrow, how we can, yes, maybe make it a little clearer.
Yes, and you would have my full support in arguing that there should be a special calendar for this effort, because it is so much work you're putting in there, and then having it just being hidden in the normal course calendar is just a waste of effort. And particularly because the course calendar only looks ahead a few 6 weeks or something, and you have a calendar that looks ahead much further, and so it would be easier to advertise these events if there was a separate calendar.
You are noted and quoted, I assure you. Thank you.
Thank you.
We are at the top of the hour, but do we have any more questions for John? Yeah, John, let me just make one comment and a follow-up question. So first of all, the satisfaction numbers that we're getting from the survey are phenomenal. Being across the board at 4+ is really amazing. Yeah, so I'd also like to call out the great work that Lorna and Lisanne do with the evaluation. We've been very happy working with them also. One quick question. I know you couldn't cover everything in this presentation, but did you notice any breakdown of satisfaction by demographics? For example, that men were more satisfied than women, or vice versa, or attendees at smaller universities had higher or lower levels of satisfaction?
I have personally, it's an excellent question. I have personally not seen anything that's so overt that it's obvious. I think we are pretty much level across the board. If some discrepancy were to show up, we'd address it. So I monitor that myself, and I don't see anything like that. On the other hand, it probably deserves to be something that we only have so much funding for Lorna and Lisanne, and I have endless things to ask of them because they are so good. And that probably is something that should make our routine list to ask of them is, can we tease out anything? I can tell you there's nothing blatant, just because it is something I do look at.
Okay, good. All right, thank you, John. So we should wrap up. We are actually a couple minutes past the hour. As usual, the presentations, the recordings, and the slides will be on the ECSS Symposium website. And for all of you ECSS staffers who haven't presented in a while, get in touch with me directly if you would like to present at our symposium next year. All right, thank you very much.
Thanks, Bob.
Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.
Thanks. Bye.